Let's get more on Sir Keir Starmer's warning that there must be a US backstop to any future peace deal for Ukraine as the only way to deter Russia from attacking again. He did, though, repeat his offer to commit British troops to a peacekeeping force if there is a deal in future.
We're at the very early stage of the process. Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
Well, the Prime Minister was speaking after he attended that summit with European leaders in Paris ahead of tomorrow's talks in Saudi Arabia between Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Justin Logan is Director of Defence and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Good evening to you, Justin.
Good evening.
What do you make there of the British Prime Minister saying that there must be a US backstop to any peace deal? That doesn't seem to be what J.D. Vance was saying when he was at the security conference in Munich. I mean, he was saying there's going to be certainly not going to be any US boots on the ground and that America's not going to be the guarantor of peace in Europe.
Yes, I found myself recurringly looking back at Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Grief as I've seen the European response to what transpired over the last week in Brussels and in Munich. And of course, Kubler-Ross wrote that the stages of grief range from initially denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and ultimately acceptance. And I think to listen to Prime Minister Starmer and a number of other European leaders, I think we're somewhat stuck between anger and bargaining. But I think the message that was sent clearly from the U.S. administration over the past week was the United States does not have an interest in fighting Russia over Ukraine, or indeed threatening to fight to enforce a ceasefire in Ukraine. And so the question then becomes, do the Europeans or some agglomeration of Europeans want to do so? And the answer for sitting here in Washington appears to be no.
What about the prospect of the US, for example, providing air cover if it wasn't prepared to put boots on the ground, if there was a peace deal, if there was a need to provide some kind of backstop, as our Prime Minister has put it?
Yeah, I think that all of this is sort of, if you'll forgive an American aphorism, whistling past the graveyard, right? The question is, how many personnel are willing to fight and die against the Russians in a potentially renewed war of attrition to enforce a ceasefire in Ukraine? To my mind, the U.S. administration has sent a signal fairly clearly that the answer is asymptotically close to zero for the United States. And I think there's been a lot of, if you'll forgive me, sort of empty talk among the more braggadocious of the European leaders about sending Europeans to police the ceasefire. But again, if this all redounds back to the idea of the Americans backstopping a ceasefire effort, the question becomes, why wouldn't you just put Americans on the ground in the first place to get additional deterrent value from having them there? And the answer is because the Americans have signaled they don't want to be a party to this. So I think it's a real clarion call for European leaders and indeed potentially for European people to say, how much are we willing to spend in blood and treasure on behalf of Ukraine? And it's the highest of high politics, and I think that's been absent heretofore over the last several decades of transatlantic affairs.
But isn't the problem that what we've heard from President Trump, from J.D. Vance and others, is the US saying, well, we're not prepared to provide security guarantees, and Ukraine is going to have to give up territory, and Ukraine is not going to be at the table. I mean, doesn't that, at the start of this negotiation, which begins tomorrow, hand away many potential bargaining chips?
Well, a bargaining chip is only as good as its credibility. And I think that you heard President Joe Biden say, we will not fight Russia over Ukraine because to do so would be World War III. You heard President Trump on the campaign trail say, we will not send U.S. troops to Ukraine. So the idea of holding out this apocryphal open door on behalf of Nato to Ukraine or some such factor is really, to my mind, a sort of a chimera or a fantasy. It has been a sort of disingenuous, and I think Zelensky, really to his credit, over a couple of weeks ago said, you know, I'm starting to feel like this entire proposition was disingenuous from the outset. I think he's quite right. I think it was disingenuous from the outset. And I can tell you firsthand, I was privy to discussions on the part of very prominent European states' embassies where before the Vilnius summit, they were breathing sighs of relief saying, oh, thank goodness we don't have to be the bad guy anymore. We can say that we're in favor of Ukrainian NATO membership because we know that the Americans and the Germans will block it. So there's been just an unbelievable amount of disingenuous going on for years here. And whatever else one might say about Donald Trump or Pete Hegseth or J.D. Vance, they're not being disingenuous.
What do you think we should expect from these talks between Marco Rubio and his team and Sergei Lavrov and his team in Saudi tomorrow? Are they actually going to start to sketch out some kind of future deal?
My expectations are quite low. I think that the Russians will come in and they've already kind of tried to frame things about this is restoring the broad panoply of U.S.-Russian relations, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that Rubio or his team are licensed to or even could sort of give the farm away, if you will, forgive a sort of rural American metaphor. So I think this is going to be the Russians grasping for the moon, the sea, and the stars, and the Americans saying, hey, wait a minute, we're trying to end this war. Let's get down to brass tacks and sort of get into the weeds of details of what could be reasonably expected for an initial phase of a ceasefire. And if you want to look at, for example, the Israel-Gaza issue, you know, there are 3 phases of that ceasefire, and getting even from phase 1 to phase 2 seems to be a heck of a lift. So I think that even getting into phase 1, if you will, in this context, is going to be a non-trivial effort.
Justin Logan, Director of Defence and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
My great pleasure.
Keith has questioned why the Americans are even involved in the negotiations if they're not prepared to do anything to stop Putin doing anything he wants.